Releasing Trauma is sponsored by the Global Association for Trauma Recovery. The Global Association for Trauma Recovery is a social impact organization serving as a resource for survivors and their families, dedicated to facilitating change by spreading trauma-related awareness and thus creating a more trauma-informed world. Learn more at gaftr.org. Welcome to Releasing Trauma, a Survivor's Podcast. I am your host, Tracy Osborne. I am a survivor of emotional bullying, rape, sexual assault, domestic abuse, and grief. After losing my husband in 2019, I set off on a new adventure to help other women release their trauma and create a life they can cherish. Each week, I will feature a guest expert or a survivor to share their stories, tips, wisdom, and more. The goal is so that you can take away even just the smallest nugget of information you can use in your life right now to make a change, and to remind you that you're not alone. There is life after trauma, and you can move from victim to thriver and create a life you can cherish. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Tracy Osborne. With me today is Sadhvi Bhagawati Saraswati, and we are going to be talking about her story from her journey from healing and transformation. So Sadhvi, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Tracy, it's wonderful to be with you. And it's just so wonderful that we have this technology that enables us to do this. I'm sitting in Rishikesh, India right now. And here we are able to talk as though we were sitting across a table with a cup of tea. I love it.
Absolutely. I love it too. We're thousands of miles apart, and it feels like we're just having a conversation in a coffee house or something.
Yes, it's really beautiful. So I'm very, very, very glad to be with you today.
Well, thank you. I'm super glad to have you here. So let's start out with you just, kind of telling us a little bit about your story.
Well, there's a lot of different angles of my story. My memoir, of course, as you know, as you referenced, just came out, called Hollywood to the Himalayas, A Journey of Healing and Transformation. And within that memoir, there are so many different aspects of the journey. And of course, there's even aspects of the journey that didn't make it into the memoir. But here specifically, as we speak about trauma recovery, I think the best part of the story to share is the very specific aspect of trauma. And in that way, I was raised in a very, very privileged family in Los Angeles, quite literally in Hollywood. And I grew up having all of the privilege, all of the opportunity, all of really everything that most of us are told we need in order to be happy, whether it's financial, whether it's educational. I went to Stanford University. I graduated from Stanford. But in the midst of all of this glitter, I was really suffering. I had been very severely traumatized in my early childhood. I had been sexually abused and then abandoned by my biological father. The abandonment, interestingly, on an objective level, was absolutely the best thing he possibly could have done for me. And yet, of course, when you are 8 and your father says he never wants to see you again, you don't have the ability to look at that in hindsight and to say, wow, that's the best thing he ever could have done for me.
Right.
It's extraordinarily traumatic. And so first there was the abuse, then there was the abandonment. And into my adolescence and early 20s, I did what so many of us do when we have extraordinary pain, which is we try to make it go away. And we try to make it go away in the moment as quickly as we possibly can. And so typically, whether it's drugs or it's alcohol or it's food or it's sex or it's shopping or it's gambling, whatever it may be, that becomes the way to no longer no longer feel pain in the moment. And for me, it was food. I developed a very, very severe eating disorder. I was hospitalized with bulimia many times, with tubes and IVs and the whole thing. And I lived up until when I was 25, really very identified with the trauma and identified with the story. So, I was suffering from it, suffering in terms of my emotional state. I obviously almost goes without mentioning, suffered from depression and anxiety, as well, of course, as the eating disorder. But I suffered in relationship. I didn't trust God. I didn't trust the universe. I didn't trust myself. I didn't trust others. I made sure to never be alone, not to be without a boyfriend at any time. The abandonment issues, the abandonment fear, that trauma was so deep that I was going to do whatever I needed to do to make sure it never happened again. And went from, boyfriend to boyfriend to boyfriend, eventually to husband at the age of 22. And even that didn't make it go away. Whenever he would go to work, I would freak out. I was so scared that he was never going to come back. It was like him walking off to work just for me was my father driving away. And I thought he was never going to come back. So I was really very mired in the pain and the suffering and the identification with that which had happened to me. At that point already, almost 2 decades ago. Well, the abuse had been more than 2 decades ago, and the abandonment had been almost 2 decades ago. And it ran my life. And I was very able to achieve and succeed amazingly. I mean, the human psyche is just amazing, that in the midst of all of that suffering, I was getting a Ph.D. in psychology and getting straight A's and taking 21 units a quarter and, looking to the outer world like, here is a woman who has it all. When I was 25, I went to India with a backpack because my husband was on a spiritual quest. I was not on a spiritual quest. On a very deep level, I now realize in retrospect, had felt disqualified from spirituality, disqualified from grace, as though there was something inherently and deeply wrong with me. Children, as you know, blame themselves for abuse and for basically everything that happens. And so in my mind, there must have been something wrong with me to be abused in this way and then to be abandoned in this way. And so I moved through the world with that kind of pervasive sense of there is something wrong with me, and came to India because my husband was on a spiritual quest, and I agreed to come, ironically, because I loved the food. I was a very strict vegetarian, and India was a place where I knew I could get really good and plentiful vegetarian food without having fights with waiters in languages that I didn't speak about, chicken broth and a vegetable soup or something. And we came here, and the first place we came was Rishikesh, which is this holy city where I now live. I've lived for the last 25 years now. It's this holy city on the banks of the sacred flowing waters of the Ganges River, here referred to as the Ganga River, or even as Mother Ganga, as this embodiment of the goddess, right in the lap of the Himalayas. And the first day we got here, I stood on the banks of this river, having no idea that the river was holy, having no idea that this river was the mother goddess. And I had the most powerful experience of my life. It was like a veil was pulled off of not only my eyes, but off of every way of knowing that I had. And I could see the perfection and the oneness and the infiniteness of the universe. Now, I was not a religious person. I was raised in a Reformed Jewish family, but was definitely not religious. And I was not even one of those people who say, oh, well, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. I was an academic. I was a scientist. And there I was having this experience. And along with the universe being perfect and divine and one, I was also perfect and divine and one. And it bypassed my intellectual awareness fully. And it just went into this full experiential awareness. And it transformed me in that moment. And about a week later, I'm fast forwarding, obviously, but about a week later, after a series of additional extraordinary experiences that guided me to this particular ashram and to this particular spiritual leader, this particular spiritual master revered throughout the world, I found myself sitting before him asking about fear. And he said to me, you fear because you don't trust. And I gave him my story, which is a good story. And it was a story that had always gotten me a lot of sympathy. And everybody would say, oh, you poor thing. And he looked at me and he said, are you going to take that to the grave? And I was like, God, no, of course not. I was only 25. He said, are you going to carry that to your deathbed? Maybe give it up a week before you die or a month before you die. And I was like, no, I'll give it up before that. And he looked at me and he said, you're waiting for someone to draw the line. You're waiting for someone to come in and to tell you that you can be done. He said, no one will. You can carry it to your grave. You can give it up on your deathbed, or you can give it up tonight. And he said, I want you, after the evening sacred ceremony on the banks of the river, I want you to go into the river and I want you to offer all of your pain, all of your anger into this river, and she will take it. And of course, I walked out thinking, yeah, there is no way. There is no way.
Right.
There is just absolutely no way. Rivers do not sweep away trauma. But what I didn't realize was it wasn't about the river sweeping it away. It wasn't that the river reached in and grabbed it from within me. It was about me being prepared to let it go. Me being prepared. He said, I want you to stand in that river until you can see your father's face in your eyes and say, I forgive you. And I don't know how many hours it took. I stood in that river a long time. And I cried and I prayed and I cried and I prayed. And eventually I could look at his face and see not a monster, but see a very haunted man. And a man who was really doing the very best he could with the very, very empty toolkit that he had been giving, and to actually forgive him. And what I didn't realize at the time, but of course realized shortly thereafter, was it wasn't just about giving the pain and the anger. It wasn't just about the forgiveness. It was actually about letting go of the whole identification as the victim of sexual abuse, as the one who was abandoned, and to be actually able to step out of that river, no longer identified by that which had happened decades ago. And it's now been 25 years years. And, I spent the first several months kind of waiting for it to come back, thinking, there's no way I really just did that. It's going to come back. I'm going to have an episode. I'm going to, fall apart again. And it's never happened in 25 years. And it's been just extraordinary. And it's made me really realize that, yes, obviously the work has to be done. I mean, I had spent 5-6 years in therapy. At times of my life, I was in therapy 5 days a week doing the work. But that there's actually then a time at which you say, okay, I've seen all of this darkness. I know this darkness. I no longer need to live in it. I no longer need to be identified by that which happened decades ago. I actually can be free, regardless of what someone else did to me. I deserve to be free.
That's amazing. That's quite a journey. And like you said, it's only just a snippet of your journey. So, wow. When you were talking to the gentleman, what came to my mind was basically he was saying, you're waiting for someone to give you permission to let go and to heal, when really you need to give yourself the permission to let go and heal.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
Yeah. And there's, as trauma survivors, we cling onto our trauma. It's the uncomfortable comfortness, because we're so used to the way it feels that not clinging to that trauma and that identity feels strange and uncomfortable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's also, it's a great crutch,
Yeah.
We don't have to step up to the plates of our lives. I know a lot of people in their 60s and 70s who have spent their lives using the crutch of their childhood as the reason why they never could hold a job, never could have a relationship, never could this, never could that. They're an alcoholic, they're drug addicts, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
Have used that as the crutch because it's known and it's familiar. And it's tragic because one of the core teachings of spirituality that obviously I didn't know before, but I know now, is freedom is our birthright. There is nothing that anyone can do to you that makes you unworthy of freedom or unworthy of grace. But what we do is we say, okay, you harmed me once, or maybe 10 times, maybe 50 times. But now I'm going to harm myself every minute of every hour of every day of my life because you harmed me 30 years ago, 40 years ago. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. It's like I'm going to sacrifice my life, my joy, my freedom, my peace, my health, my fullness on the altar of your craziness, on the altar of your anger, arrogance, ego, whatever it may be that led you to do this to me. I'm now going to sacrifice my life on the altar of your own story, your patterns. No.
When you put it like that, it sure sounds crazy, doesn't it?
It does. And yet that's what we do.
That's totally what we do. Like you, I developed the eating disorder and the abandonment issues, and I bounced from man to man to man. And I remember times, and this is going to sound so silly, but I remember times being angry at whoever I was with. And my way of punishing him was to stuff my face with food. Which when you look back at it, it's like, how insane is that? That you're poisoning your own body to punish somebody else. You're drinking the poison poison
expecting
somebody
them to
else.
die. Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
it just doesn't work that way. So how amazing did it feel to, when you finally realized I have let this go and it's not coming back?
It's been extraordinary. It's been so extraordinary because nobody ever told me that freedom was even a possibility. I, at the age of 25, had reached a point where I was managing my life. I was managing my eating disorder, meaning that many days I could get through the day without throwing up, not necessarily all of them by any means, but many of them I could. I was managing my eating disorder. I was managing my emotions. I was managing my marriage. I was on antidepressants. They helped me manage everything. But nobody ever said, hey, there's actually something better. There's a whole other level. I really thought that managing our lives was the very best that we could hope for. That, okay, I could learn to manage better. Maybe I could learn to manage without the antidepressants. Maybe I could learn to make it through more days without throwing up. But that essentially this would always hang over my head. This would always be my go-to stress response. That's what I was told. I mean, it wasn't something I made up. This is what I was very specifically told in hospitals, in eating disorder clinics, in 12-step groups even, of this is your thing. This will always hang over you. You can stop doing it, but this is going to be your go-to stress response. And nobody ever said to me, you can actually be free. Like, there is a possibility that you no longer will move through the world as an abuse survivor, as an abandoned daughter, as a bulimic. And it never, I would have thought that was inconceivable. And it's been just the most extraordinary, amazing experience. I mean, I never think about what I eat. I eat in a place where nobody even asks me what you want. The only thing I get asked is, what time would you like your food? And then it just shows up. And for the first many years here, we have a communal dining room. And in the first many years, I ate there. As my schedule's gotten a little bit busier over the years, I've got the flexibility now to kind of have my meal when I want it, because I've got so much else going on that I was missing a lot of meals because they would take place while I was in the middle of something else. So I now have the flexibility to get them whenever I want it. But I've never been asked, what would you like? The cook cooks. And in the communal dining room, you sit in rows, and the people come by, the members of the community who are serving that day, and they've got the food in big metal buckets, and they've got big ladles. I mean, imagine you've got hundreds of people sitting in lines next to each other in a dining room, and you've got a plate, and they literally just scoop into the bucket. You have no idea what's inside until it lands on your plate. Now, that may sound okay to someone who doesn't have an eating disorder, but the idea of, and the other rule within India is you've got to eat everything on your plate. Like, food is God. If you don't want it, don't take it. But once it is on your plate, you have to finish it. And so they would just dump whatever had been cooked that day from a bucket that I couldn't even see what was in it onto my plate. And what was amazing was it never provided, not even once, an iota of stress or tension. I would sit in those rows and just have my food dumped onto my plate from a bucket and eat so happily. And it literally, I mean, in 25 years, I've never had a return of even the urge to either binge or to throw up.
That's amazing.
It's really, really amazing. And I have people come, and in India, traditionally, when people come to see a religious leader, they bring something. They bring flowers, they bring fruit, they bring sweets. And so I've had people bring, all kinds of boxes of sweets and whatnot. And they sit on the coffee table in my office where I meet people, and they could sit there for weeks or months until, they get finished by whoever I'm meeting. And it never would occur to me to actually stand up and to go over and to finish them all off.
Wow. That is complete liberating freedom.
It's extraordinary. It's grace. That's why I say it is grace, but it is grace that is available. It's available to all of us.
Right.
If we're able to let go of the whole identity that has thrust us into the behavioral pattern.
Wow. Well, Sadhvi, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story with us today. This has been amazing. Tell us a little bit more about your book and how listeners can find it.
Sure. Well, the book is called Hollywood to the Himalayas, A Journey of Healing and Transformation. And it's the story of these 25 years that I have lived in India, what I have learned, how I've experienced it. It's very funny. I wasn't sure that it was going to be funny until I had people read it. I know that for me, humor and lightness is a way that I take myself a lot. And I've got all of these kind of inside jokes with myself. I just wasn't sure they were going to be funny to other people until I've had so many people say, this book is really funny. I'm laughing out loud. So it's the journey on the plot level of a 25-year-old white Jewish Stanford educated Ph.D. student who goes to India, has this amazing experience, and ends up becoming a holy woman, like a spiritual leader in this country, and speaking at the United Nations and at so many huge global platforms. And it's that incredible story and of what it's like to become celibate. And, I took vows of renunciation, of monastic renunciation 21 years ago. And it's that, but the core thread that runs through a lot of it is, it begins, of course, with me standing in the river, offering my pain to the river. That's the opening chapter. And so it takes you through what I suffered, not in excruciating detail, but just enough so that the readers understand, oh yeah, she knows suffering, she knows trauma, so that nobody can think that the peace and the joy and the freedom that I found is unavailable to them. I had to give enough details of the abuse so that people would know, oh yeah, okay, she's experienced some serious stuff.
Yeah.
And it's that, and what I suffered with the eating disorder and the addictions, and then what it was like to let it go, how I did it, and then the challenges, because of course it's not like all in one fell swoop. I mean, parts of it were all in one fell swoop, but then life is still there, and the human psyche is still there, and struggles are still there. And so what I struggled with and what the challenges have been and what I've learned. And it's been so extraordinary to be able to share it. And you can get it. It's available, obviously, on Amazon for sure. Okay. If it's not available in your local bookstore and you prefer to use your local bookstore than Amazon, ask them to order it. Ask them to order an extra 10 copies for your 10 closest friends to buy it as well. And yeah, I mean, obviously Amazon is the easiest place to get it. And the other last piece is, one of the arcs of the story, of course, is the arc of my specific journey from literally Hollywood to literally the Himalayas via Palo Alto. And that's the fascinating, funny, amazing, inspiring journey. But then there's also the journey of the changing of how I think, the changing of the identification from what I think of as the Hollywood way of thinking, which is you are your body, you are your history, you are your story, you are all of that, to the Himalayan way of thinking, which is you have a body, you have a history, but you're not it.
Right.
Who you are is divine and is whole and is complete and is pure and is one with the creator and with all of creation. And that is something that everyone can have, regardless of physically where they may be, regardless of physically what their journey may be. It's not that they have to come to India or you have to stand on the banks of the Ganga. That shift is something that can happen anywhere because it's a shift in thought.
Right. Well, Sadhvi, thank you so much again for coming on this show and talking with us and, giving us your story. Listeners, you know the drill. I will have all of her contact information, the link to the book, everything in the show notes. Just head over to releasingtraumapodcast.com and pull up Sadhvi's show, and all her information will be there. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you in the next show.